Welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. Today we're going to paint a washing line with all the tea towels blowing in the breeze in Nova Scotia. This is photographed by Janet Fleming Ritchey, so thank you Janet for this gorgeous photograph, and get ready with your paper and paints, and you might want to use a little bit of masking fluid on those tea towels to keep them nice and crispy white. It's up to you. I don't like masking fluid very much, but sometimes it's really useful. So you decide. Mine is on, I think, 5" by 8" paper. You need a little bit longer for this one to fit it all in. So let's get painting. I have my board at a slight angle, then the paint is going to run down. Now, I used for mine, because this sky is just very plain blue, and I think it's important for this painting that it's just plain, no clouds, nothing to distract. I used just Cobalt Blue, and I think that was the closest match to the sky. I tried a couple of others. This is horrible paper, so look at the difference between good paper and horrible paper, the difference in your wash. It looks so different. So this is Cobalt Blue. This is Cobalt with a little bit of Phthalo Blue, and this is Cobalt with a little bit of Rose to make a warmer sky. And I still think that just Cobalt is the best way to go. And what you need to do is you need to have a lot of paint mixed up before you start, because the reason this time that we're working on dry paper is to get that lovely intense blue. If we were working on wet paper, we wouldn't get it nice and intense. It would be very washed out. You can see down here, I added too much water to the paint down here, and I got one of those blooms, one of those back runs. That's because I was painting carefully around the tea towels because I didn't have any masking fluid. So you do have to be very, very careful, and that's why you tilt the board. So we'll take a deep breath. Before we get going, we need lots of paint. So I'm going to grab a number 10 brush. Need quite a big brush. So my number 10 is going to give me lots of area to get the paint on. And I need to, first thing I always do, don't know if you noticed, first thing I always do is get a couple of brush loads of water on here to mix my color in, which means I completely submerge my brush in the water, wiggle it to get it loaded with water, and then it's going to pick up a good amount of water. And I put that on there first. Then I get my paint and add it to that water. Here's another tip. Don't do this. Don't spread it all around your palette. I see that so often. Just in the center. Just a little puddle like this, and it should be a puddle. It should be very movable. And I want to do the whole sky, so I'm getting a bit more water, a bit more paint. I don't want to run out. And now my horrible paper, I have to test this color. Not going to look as good on the bad paper. The cotton paper is going to absorb this way more than the other paper. So you really do need a big brush, and you need to go start at the top. I need a bit more paint. Start at the top, go across, and keep dipping your brush in the paint. Don't let the paint run out. Otherwise, you're going to get streaky paint. What you should have at the bottom of your paint is called a bead. It means that there's a bead of paint that's nice and wet at the bottom. And when you go back with your brush, you just come up against the bead. It will make your paint flow on nice and easy. Now I have to be careful here. I've got to paint around the roof. This is why I must, because there's a lot to paint around. And because your paper's dry, you don't have time to stop and make more paint.
I'm coming down here. Now there's a little hill in the background, and I sort of want to leave that little hill, little mountain, so I can paint it lighter. So I'm going to paint around where that would be. I'm going to have trees and stuff there. Now, what's happened here is my bead is too big, so I have to adjust that bead. I have to suck a little bit up with what's called a thirsty brush. That's a brush that I've taken the moisture out of, and I have a Kleenex here, and every time I suck a little bit of that paint up, I'm just wiping it on my Kleenex. Now, don't suck too much of that paint up. That won't be good. And what I also need to do is I just need to clean off that little bit that's on my masking fluid here. But I got to be really careful because, whoops, I touched the sky, so I have to be really, really careful. Now, I'm going to let you do that without being distracted. You need to sort of do it in one fell swoop with no distractions. And try and get that little bit in there. It will look quite dark, but it will dry much, much lighter. And remember, you need it dark for those lovely, colorful and bright tea towels to stand out. Otherwise, they won't stand out. So if you look at mine's probably not even as dark as my original. My original was a little bit darker, and it will dry a bit lighter. Now, as it's drying, I'm going to take that tape away and just let it flatten out so I don't get too much run. Make sure the sides don't have too much wet on. Don't want any run backs into my sky. And once that is done, we can't go on because we can't do the house because it will bleed into the sky. We can't do the hill, it will bleed into the sky. I can't do the laundry because it needs the sky to be dry. So we'll have to let that soak in and do our triads while that's soaking in. What we can do as well, if you have scrap paper, we can practice. I think it's really good to practice mixing the green for the house because it's quite a tricky color to get, and it's quite an important color to get that dusty olivey green. And we're going to be sort of experimenting with that with our triad too, more olivey greens. And if you don't have 100% cotton paper, you will struggle a bit to get your sky in a nice flat wash, because these cheap papers, student grade papers, they don't give you a nice flat wash. They don't dry evenly, and they don't absorb the water the way that the cotton does. So you can never really get a nice even wash, but that's okay. It's watercolor, so what you get is what you get, and it will look like a watercolor at least. I think the flat wash is the hardest one to master. Even though it looks like it's just flat color, shouldn't be difficult. I think it's the hardest one to get looking flat with no runs, no streaks, no. I mean, look, I've been painting a long time, and my flat wash has got a great big water bloom in it here. It's very, very hard to get a flat wash on without any streaks or blooms or bubbles or accidents. Now, don't be hard on yourself. It's a tough one. And the color for the house is quite a tough one too. I did a lot of little samples to try and get that green that the house is painted, and I came up with the best one I could get was Cerulean Blue with some Azo Yellow, which of course you can use a Cadmium Yellow, and a little bit of Raw Sienna. So we're going to try mixing the house color before we even start the triad. So if you've finished your blue sky and you're waiting to move on, you can get a piece of scrap paper or cheap paper or something to practice your house colors on. Let's zoom in, and it's going to depend on the ratio of each color that you use. So I'm going to start with the yellow. It's always a good place to start. I'm going to put down the Azo Yellow. And then the other yellow is the Earth Yellow, which is the Raw Sienna. I'm going to put down the Raw Sienna. Sorry, I need to move it. And now I've got to add the Cerulean Blue until I get something that looks like a dull green color. And then I need to test it. I need to put it on the paper and see what it looks like. Now I'm thinking it still looks a little bit bright compared to the house, although it will dull down as it dries. So I'm going to add a little bit of raw sienna. You can use yellow ochre instead of raw sienna. And I'm going to try it with a little bit of raw sienna, and that's making it a little bit more dull, a little bit more olivey. And I think, and let's try it with a little bit more cerulean blue, just a touch more cerulean blue. Of course, it doesn't have to be perfect. I added a little bit more water. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's kind of nice if it's close, because the colors in this play off each other. The orange and the green in the tea towels sort of go with the blue and the green in the house. Now I think when I added a little bit of cerulean blue back in, I think this third mix is closest to the house. Let's take it up to the edge of the paper and then hold it against the house. I think it's good enough, close enough to what I want. So you can't just mix three colors and hope it comes out right the first time. You kind of mix the three, test it, and then go back and add a little bit of something else and a little bit of something else. And that's what the triads are sort of trying to train you to do. And I've actually got a phthalo green in the triad today, because we can mix something similar with that too and see what we get. So we get a comparison between what we've got here and the phthalo that we're going to use in the triad. So I think that's looking pretty good. I'll leave that there for when we do the house. You try out and you may have to try, a few times going back and forth, adding a little bit more of something, a little bit less of something, a little bit more water perhaps, to get it to the right color. And it's really important to hold it up close to your photo if you want to try and color match. In fact, in the photo, there are places where it's more raw sienna-ish. So to get that kind of look, if you want to do the siding looking a little bit more aged, you can put some raw sienna in some places on the siding. Got something in mine there, little hair. And then wet in wet, you can come up against it with the green that you're mixing and go back and forth. And when you do the siding, if you want your siding to look kind of like aging paint, that will work really well if you feel like you want to do wet in wet with two colors, as long as it's wet in wet. Because if I can see there are places here on the siding where the paint is dull and it looks more raw sienna-ish. So I think that's also a really good look. And it's very complementary to the tea towels, which have those colors in them as well. It's kind of fun. So I'll let you play a little bit with mixing your house color and do some house painting. And of course, we cannot do that till the sky is dry. And we need a little bit of drying time. So for our yellow, we're going to start with the raw sienna, an earth yellow. And I don't think we've used in our triads an earth yellow yet. Of course, it's going to make very earthy, muted colors. And I haven't branched out too much in the triad colors, because I know that a lot of you are not going to have many colors of paint to do that, but it's still a really good thing to learn to mix different varieties of what you've got. And then I'm going to do the rose. And if you don't want to use your rose this time and you want to use one of your other cool reds, such as Rose Doré, or I'm trying to think of the other rose ones, is slipped my mind. Can't think of what the other rose is. But if you want to try one of your other paints, please do. Rose Madder. Just had to look at my paint box. It's right there. You can try those ones as well if you want to do some experimenting. And Phthalo Green. I don't think we've used Phthalo Green yet. You can also use Viridian Green. A lot of the paint mix companies make Viridian with Phthalo Green. They use the same pigment. They're very, very similar. Phthalo is a little bit more intense, a little bit stronger color staining. It's transparent. The Viridian's not always as transparent because what they do is they mix some white with the Phthalo Green and call it Viridian. So you have a little bit of white, making it less transparent. But this Phthalo is very transparent. The rose is very transparent, and the Raw Sienna is semi-transparent. So all of your colors are going to look like earthy colors. So let's start with the Raw Sienna and mixing a little tiny bit of the permanent rose in with it. And it really does need just a tiny bit for the one closest to our Raw Sienna. And use yellow ochre if that's what you have. A little bit more rose in with that. And then a little bit more rose in with it. Now this Raw Sienna and rose are also very good skin colors if you dilute them. They look kind of strong as they are. But if they're diluted, they actually make a lovely skin color. Let's get my nice piece of paper and dilute them out. I still got just Raw Sienna and rose, and actually draw a face so you can just get an idea. So very, very, very basic face, and I've diluted that color out with a lot of water. Put it down, not paint up in the air. And then I'm going to put it on what would be a portrait. And you should be able to see what a beautiful skin color those two colors make. And of course you could add more rose for cheeks, lips, nose. Now, Raw Sienna with the Phthalo Green is going to make some lovely greens that, again, could possibly work for the house. So let's try that with starting with the Raw Sienna. Get my tray over here. And then adding now Phthalo Green is really, really strong. Change out brushes. So be careful when you add the Phthalo Green to the Raw Sienna for your first green, because it'll go green very quickly. So I've just got a real little touch of green in this one. And a tiny, tiny, tiny touch more. Oh, too much, already too much. So if I get too much, I have to go back and put in a little bit of raw sienna. A little bit more raw sienna. But you can see from a really bright, vibrant green to adding a little bit of raw sienna, it comes right down to a lovely sage green. And then I'll add a little bit more phthalo green. So this is just taking it down a little bit from that bright, bright phthalo. The phthalo colors are staining, intense, long lasting. And you wouldn't want to use this phthalo green for vegetation. It's too strong. But just a little tiny bit of raw sienna with it, and you've got a beautiful color for vegetation. And now I'm going to come down the rose side with the paint. Let's get a little clean area here, making sure you can kind of see what I'm doing. I'll start with the rose. Make sure I have enough. And a tiny, tiny bit of phthalo with that rose. It will go very gray very quickly. Wow. It's actually gone a gray kind of violet very, very quickly. And we're using the green is sort of replacing the blue in a primary triad. But green and pink make some really, really pretty grays. So a little bit more green. Forgot to dilute that one. Now you can see when you get midway here how pretty this gray is, a lovely, warm, transparent gray. And I'll dilute that out. And now we want one that's pretty heavy on the green. You're going to get something that's almost black with one that's heavy on green. Or at least a very, very dark gray. Oh, interesting colors, very, very muted colors because we've got the raw sienna. And of course, red and green, although they say they make brown, they don't. They will often make gray rather than brown, especially if it's one of those pinky, cool pinky reds. You'll get some very, very pretty grays. Let's try with the neutrals. We've already got pretty good neutrals here and here. So let's try and mix an equal amount of everything. And you should get, that's when you'll get more of a brown when you add in the raw sienna or yellow ochre. This is pretty much an equal mix here. There's a gray called Davies gray that is very similar to these three colors. I have one here, so I'll compare it. Maybe not as dark. Adding a little bit of water. Too much on my parts. I don't want water. There we go. So let me try out my Davies grey. Davies grey I always think is a green color. So this color beside it right here is Davies grey. And I think if I had just a little bit more green in the mix, it would be very close to that. With the rose, extra rose in this one, it's a little more pinky. And there's a nice sort of little separation happening. The raw sienna will granulate a bit, so it's kind of separating the colors, kind of pretty. Now I want one that's mostly green. I'm just going to use my mix here and mix one that's mostly green. And again, it takes that vibrant, in your face phthalo green, which is very strong, and it turns it into something like a beautiful pine forest green just by adding a little bit of raw sienna and a little bit of rose. If you use Viridian or phthalo green for your trees and your forests and your plants, try diluting it down with one of these other colors, with a yellow, with a rose, or with a brown or something, so that it looks more natural. Now I'll start fresh with my one that's going to be mostly red, or in this case rose. So I'll start with a little tiny bit of raw sienna and a little tiny bit of phthalo green, and then I get a nice brush full of rose. I'm going to try that. Rose is very dominant, so every time we do one of these neutrals, you'll find your rose is dominating the color and making a very similar neutral. And now one that is mainly raw sienna, our earth yellow. I'll start with a little tiny bit of rose and a tiny bit of phthalo green, and then a nice brush full of raw sienna. So it takes it down closer to well, not a burnt sienna, but definitely a brown. Now the raw sienna is made with pigment brown 7. So it's already a brown pigment. This is just a much darker raw sienna. And not quite as dark as this is burnt sienna. So burnt sienna is a little bit more reddy, but close. Definitely close. It's, if I added, I'm going to add a little bit of cadmium red to that mix and put that there, and a bit of burnt sienna above it. I bet you we could get very close to burnt sienna just by adding a bit of bright red to this raw sienna mix. Or an orange. Remember the transparent orange made it very burnt sienna-ish too. Well, that's our little triad for this week. And I know we're not using the phthalo green in the composition today, although this center one here is pretty close to the house color. But I just want to try and vary your notes a little bit, so you've got a variety of colors that you can look back on and see what they mixed. I'm going to use my hairdryer. Let's lift my camera up again. Use my hairdryer and make sure that my sky is perfectly dry before I move on and paint the house. One thing you want to avoid when you have masking fluid on your painting, if it gets too hot, the heat can bond it to your paper and you can't get it off, or it rips your paper when you get it off. So you have to be very, very careful. I kind of dried up here away from the masking fluid and down here away from the masking fluid on a low heat rather than a high heat, because masking fluid is a very sticky, annoying substance that doesn't always behave well for you. So we're going to mix that green for the house again. And I can make use of what paint I have on here. I have some of that Raw Sienna mix here. I'm going to mix it with the Cerulean Blue and the Raw Sienna. And then a little bit of the Azo Yellow or Cadmium Yellow. Bit more Cerulean Blue. I've got to get it to that soft house color. And I need to test it. There it is. Right, let's see. Might need a little bit more blue in it. Yeah, I think that's going to work. And the other thing I want to do in mine is I want to do what I suggested, was have a little bit of Raw Sienna in there, wet in wet. So I have those couple of colors. I actually did that in mine. I don't know if you can see here, down here, I put some Raw Sienna first on the bottom part of the house. So I'm going to do that. Make sure it's wet enough that it's going to blend wet in wet. And I'm going to put some on. I have my number 10 brush again because I don't want to be struggling to get paint on. A little bit of Raw Sienna down there, and now go into my house green. And don't get worried about my washing. It's masked, so I can go over it. Now, I don't want my green paint too thick. I want it to look very washed out. And don't forget, on the edge of the roof, I don't know what all the terms are for things, but there's edging, whatever that stuff's called. And that's going to be very light. It's going to be a Raw Sienna color. So don't paint over that. And take a little bit of Raw Sienna again. Add a little bit in here, wet and wet. Go back to my green. There's some kind of strange box on the side of the roof here. I'm going to get a little bit of Cerulean Blue, just, oh, mine's very strong. And I'm going to bring a little bit of just Cerulean Blue in just this side here. Add a little bit of interest to the shadows. And what I have to be careful of is, what I warned you about, is don't go over I haven't masked off the edge of the roof here. I just went over a little bit, so I've got to clean that up, fill that in. There. That's enough fiddling with the house. If you keep painting too much, you take paint off and you get a lot of brush strokes. So you don't want to overpaint an area, especially not something that's a big area of flat color. I'm just going to dab a little bit off of the masking fluid. Let's clean that up a little bit. Now the edge of the roof is not touching the green in any way, So we could do the edge of the roof, but I think it's probably better to wait until we've done at least the background hill here. Now I'm just going to check what I used. I think I used a very similar mix. I've said the raw sienna is used for the distant hill and the roof edge trim. So similar color. The hill in the background is that dry grass. So I'm going to get my raw sienna just by itself. And I'm just going to fill in, this is just raw sienna, fill in that background hill. I'm going to have trees in front of this and possibly some greenery on it. So I'm not going to worry too much about doing any detail on it at the moment. I'm just going to put it on there. I did go over the edge of my blue, which is not a good thing. Let's zip that up with a Kleenex. And of course, I can't do my trees until this raw sienna starts to dry quite a bit. There's a lot of things I can't do. I can't do the shadow under the roof until the roof is dry, but we can do that, the dark roof. So, and I'm still wondering whether it's best not to until we've got the other colors in, like the raw sienna edging. I could take the masking off of the laundry up to the roof edge because I finished with the sky. I'm going to use my little masking fluid pickup tool and just gently roll my masking fluid off. Very sticky stuff. You need to be gentle because if you're not, you're going to rip your paper or you're going to damage your paint. Take your time. Now, some people get their masking fluid off by rolling their finger on it like this. Here's the danger with that. Your fingertips have a lot of oil on them. They're always quite oily, and you do not want to touch or brush watercolor paper with oily fingertips because any oil that you put on the paper will resist the paint or make an odd blob on the paint. And that's not a good thing. So I would advise you use, the best thing is the pickup tool because the pickup tool doesn't erase your pencil lines and you want some of your pencil lines to see where you're going to paint. You can use a piece of rolled up masking fluid to remove your masking fluid. That works too. You can use a soft white eraser, but if you use the soft white eraser, it will erase all of your pencil lines, so you won't see your pencil lines if you need them. So that's not always advisable, but it is a good way to get the masking fluid off. The best way are these little pickups that I pick up in Dollar Tree for $1.25. Now my house paint is still wet, so I don't want to use it over there, but I at least have opened up my sky a little bit and it will give me something to work on. I can work on pegs or I can work on the pattern on the tea cloths, all that kind of stuff while other things are drying. Now I think my green house paint is definitely dry enough that I can put the edge trim on the roof here. So again, I'm just going to use raw sienna. And it's just a very small amount my raw sienna is very diluted. And probably the trim on the house was white. It's just old and stained. I'm popping that on with some raw sienna. And so that it looks old, you can add a little bit of gray. You can mix a gray with the raw sienna, some blue and some rose, just like we just did for the triads. I'm just grabbing a little bit of rose. I have a little bit of cobalt from my sky and a little bit of raw sienna. And that's mixing up a gray color. And I'm going to use a little bit of that gray, looking at the photograph, and I keep putting my brush on that thing instead of my sponge. At the edge of the what is that called on the roof? I know what it's called, but I can't ever remember it. Anyway, you know what I mean. This edging on the roof here, I'm adding just a little bit of gray, wet and wet with the raw sienna in patches, because it is old and it is kind of patchy. But I don't want to add too much because I want the edging to be lighter than the green on the roof. I'm just adding a little bit of gray. Really sort of waiting for everything to dry up a little bit, especially my hill right here. And for the trees around here, I have mixed the Cobalt Blue and the Azo Yellow and then a little bit of burnt sienna to darken it up a little bit. And of course I have here, I have the Phthalo Green mix that I made for our triad. No reason I can't use a bit of that as well. Do the same thing. I can add a little bit of the Azo Yellow. I'm not going to waste it. A little bit of the Cobalt Blue to it. And a little bit of burnt sienna. The burnt sienna just darkens it up. We don't want the green to come forward in the painting. We want it to go into the background. So I just used that color I had for the triad with the Phthalo Green and added a little bit of yellow and burnt sienna, a little bit of the cobalt, a little bit of each until I get a nice dark foresty green. And I'm going to use that to do the trees behind the house. I will start, if I'm going to do those trees, I'm going to start with the edge because I just painted the house and the roof here. So if I start over here, that will give this plenty of time to dry before I come back to it. So little brush now, I just have my number 2 brush because I'm just going to do some little trees and they're coming in from the side of the painting or the photograph here. And one of the trees, you just see some of it. So I'm starting with that one first. It's just poking in. If I bring the photo over, just poking in from the side here. So I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna. This one seems a little brown, a little warmer for this tree next to it. So I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to my mix. And the tree next to it is not as tall, so I don't want to make it as tall as that first one. Now zoom in so you can even see what I'm doing a little better. With my little number 2 brush, I'm just painting these sort of scrubby fir trees on that distant. And you can't see much of that distant hill, so I don't want much of it showing either. It's going to be too prominent. There's a couple of them there together, little ones. If I feel that the background of the hill is too light, I'm going to come back later with a little bit of dark green to fill that up. Now there's a couple of taller trees just here and here, and they're a bit more blue, so I will add a little bit more cobalt to my mix. Even like a tiny touch of phthalo even, if I want to get them a little bit greener, those two, and they are much taller, so we're going to have them. These ones come up above the, I think they're telephone lines or power lines, I'm not sure which, but they come up above them anyway. They're quite thin at the top. I usually find my way by just putting a line down with my brush or my pencil. Add a little bit more burnt sienna to it. And as they come down towards the edge, there's just kind of a mass of trees there. You don't have to have lots of openings or individual branches. And there's just one more here, not quite as tall. Bit scrubby at the top. And coming down here. And the tree that is sort of here is more of a, I think like more of a deciduous tree. It's more yellowy. So for that one, I want to get a little bit more of my Azo Yellow and just add that to the mix. You can't see my mix. I've got lots of mixes here. A little bit on the side, there's a little bit more yellow, and there's a gap. There's a bit of a gap between the trees. So this one over here is it's not a fir tree, kind of some kind of a bush here. So I don't want to make it look like a fir tree. I'm going to sort of let the brush dance about a bit and make it into more of a shrub or something like that. Now, the background hill is very stark. I will be putting a little bit more green and shade on it, but right now I want to do the trees and not worry about that. So right beside the house, we need to go fairly dark so that the house stands out. So I have a lot of these greens all here, and I want to add a bit more burnt sienna to the ones near the house, and maybe even a little bit of ultramarine blue to get much darker trees next to the house. So I didn't modify my whole green mix, just a corner of it. And I'll start by the house because I just did this one. I don't want it to flood into this one too much. And you can kind of see a little bit of the tree poking out from the house here. I'm just trying to make sure the heights are all different. Don't make all your heights of trees the same. Also, I don't want to accidentally paint over my house either. I got a couple like that, and I think just there's one more kind of tall one, or a couple of tall ones back here. And they kind of come across the deciduous bush there. I'm not going to come right across them now. I'm going to do a little bit later of extra greenery. And you don't want to fuss too much with these. These are background details, all in the background. Now those dark greens that I have are going to be very useful because we have some shadow along the roof here that we can use those to make the shadow. And if you look at the shadow, it's pretty hard edged, this shadow. So you don't want it soft or gentle, and it's quite sometimes a little scary to put on just a dark shadow and then leave it and not try and blend it in, but it will work, don't worry, it'll be fine. So I've said mix a little of the dark gray with the greenhouse color paint and paint the shadow under the roof. So I have a dark gray here that I've suggested for the roof, which is Cobalt Blue, Burnt Sienna, Permanent Rose, and Azo Yellow, or you can use Payne's Gray if you have a Payne's Gray. It's totally up to you. I'll show you the difference on a piece of paper. Let's take this is my Payne's, grab my Payne's Gray. Go back a bit. So this is my Payne's Gray. It's just a nice, easy color to grab if you just have a little bit of roof to paint and you don't want to be mixing up a whole bunch of colors to make a gray. I will mix one as well, and you can just decide what you want to do. If you've got Payne's Gray, just use it. It's only a little bit. If you don't have one, you can use, I've suggested some Cobalt Blue or Ultramarine Blue. Either one is good. Burnt Sienna. And Permanent Rose. And Azo Yellow. And then you have to go back and forth to get it to make a gray. So it's if you've got a Payne's Gray, it's a lot easier to just grab a brush full. I mean, it's a very greeny gray. If I want a more bluey gray, I can add Ultramarine Blue to that too. And get a more bluey gray. Oh, I got a great big blob of gray on my paint. I never usually mix paint with my tray above my painting, but that's where my camera is, so I have to lift up my tray, and I'm terrible at getting blobs on there. So you can use either one for the roof. I'm going to do the roof now. I want I've got my number 4 brush, and I'll use the gray I just mixed up. And I'm just going to paint the roof nice and dark. I'm going to do what I quite often do, which is I'm going to turn it around. It's going to make it much easier for me to paint with my hand over dry paint, and easier to control the brush too. There's not much roof showing because the perspective of the photo is just looking straight on. There's a tiny sliver of roof showing. And also I'm going down to my number 2 brush because I want a very, I'm going to turn this right around. I want a very thin line down the other side of the roof. And I got to be careful to remember, don't paint right. That's when it's dangerous to actually take your masking fluid off, because you might forget not to paint over your washing. I'll turn it back around. Not completely straight, so I'm just going to brighten it up a little bit. So you can mix that dark mix with your greeny mix to make the shadow color. So here's my greeny mix. I get some of my dark mix that I just made, and I'll mix it with that. And I will, maybe a little bit of cobalt blue, a lot of blue in shadows, a little bit of water so I can get it on in a nice, there we go, a little bit more water. Sometimes you want to see through your shadow, and the shadow is quite wide on this side of the roof. I don't want the shadow exactly the dark color of the dark gray roof. It may look like that in the photograph, but photographs often suck a lot of color out of things. So if you were looking at the roof in daylight with your eyes rather than the camera, you would see that it was not the dark charcoal gray of the roof. You'd see it as a dark, very dark green, bluey green shadow. I'm going to put that on that side, and it's very much thinner on this side. I actually gave myself a little pencil line just to help me find where the shadow goes. And down here. And like I say, you need to have a very hard edge. No blending it in with a wet brush or anything. You don't need to do that. I just want to look at the photo because there is, under this odd little box that's on the side here, there's also a shadow from that as well. Just here. And lots of other shadows on the siding as well. But I need an even smaller brush for those. I need one of those liner brushes that I love so much. Here's mine. This is my 2/0 liner brush. And I'm going to water that color down a little bit more because I don't want the planking to be as obvious as the shadows. And the first thing I want to do is this siding that's here looks like it's boarding up a window or something. I want to make sure I put that in with my liner brush. And there's another one here. And then there's also planking on the house. Now, you don't need to do all of the lines of the planking. The photo, of course, shows all of the lines, but that's not necessary in a painting. You can just show a few of them to give the idea of planking. They don't need to be perfectly straight because some of this planking is kind of knotty, but they do need to be parallel to what would be the lines of the house. So I made sure that I penciled them on there first so that I didn't get them all going downhill or in the wrong direction. Otherwise that looks a bit odd. But they don't need to be perfectly straight, that's for sure. And you don't need to do the whole line of the planking. You can just do a little bit and the eye will kind of fill in the rest. This is where the liner brushes are a lovely tool to have because it's so lovely and thin. And now it's starting to look a little bit more like a house with that with the shadows, with the roof, with the planks on. Just a few little details and maybe a couple more here. I kind of like that in the photo, you can kind of see some kind of broken, and you can see a few joins of the planking here, some that are a bit twisted. Kind of nice to have just a few of those in. And that's enough. You don't want to overdo the detail, that's for sure. The other thing is you can see that now I've got all the shadow under the roof here and the dark roof. That's made the raw sienna that I put on look very, very light. And you might want to, when everything is dry, add a little bit more patchy raw sienna there if you want to. The other thing is this hill in the background looks way too light. But I'm not sure if my trees are dry enough to work on it. But what you want to do when your trees are dry is add a little bit more greenery and raw sienna and burnt sienna to this background hill, so it's not so in your face standing out. I think it's time to work on the washing. While my shadows are drying, I am going to work on the washing that's over on the right, and I'm going to work on the pegs. I think the pegs are fun. I want to get some nice bright yellow on some of those pegs. So clean water, tiny little brush, and your brightest yellow, whether that's Azo or Cadmium, whichever is your brightest yellow. Let's put some lovely bright pegs in. I'm going to just get some clean water, clean number 2 brush, nice bright yellow paint. And the first one, I'm kind of sticking right to the photo because sometimes if you don't, you just get lost. First yellow one that I see in the photo is right here. I'm going to pop that one in. And there's also one on this side too. These are just tiny tea towels, and this person has like doubled up with those great big giant pegs. They made sure those tea towels aren't going anywhere. I'll pop in those yellow pegs. And there's one more just here. There's some over here too, but I can't do those until I unmask. I get those in. Over here, it's interesting. I'm sure all of you have all had a washing line before. I love this. There's this little white plastic thing here that the top line goes through. And that's why the top line has kind of a kink in it, because it's going through this little plastic divider there. That's right here. I want a turquoise now. If you don't have a turquoise for your turquoise pegs, you can use cobalt teal. You could use phthalo blue. I actually have a paint that's called turquoise. So I'm breaking it out for the turquoise pegs. And this one here. And of course, don't put wet paint next to your yellow pegs. I'm doing my turquoise peg here. You don't want to make them too thick either, the paints for these pegs, or they will blend into the sky too much. The blue pegs are almost the same blue as the sky, like the cobalt blue. So you could either use cobalt with a touch of turquoise in it, you could use ultramarine, or if you don't want them to blend into the sky, you can put a turquoise peg there. I'm going to use a little bit of ultramarine, I think, for the blue pegs, so that it's going to look a little bit darker than the sky. Ultramarine is almost the same color as cobalt, it's just a little darker. little bit more intense. Don't want to do those ones because I have yellow there. I'll end up with green pegs, so I'm just going to be a little bit careful with those. Can't do too much at once. The white washing line, I masked a little bit of it, but I'm going to use my PH Martin's white for that. You can also use a white pen. There's some pretty good white pens out there. There's Uniball pens, Posca pens. They all do a nice fine white line. Jelly roll pens. So I'm just getting a little bit of my PH Martin's bleed proof white. Take this sideways. Yeah. So I can pull the brush towards me. Need a little bit more water on my brush. Pulling it towards me just to put that washing line in there. And then it'll meet up with my masking fluid at the end here. I will do it over the house too later. This is putting in my first wash of the white there, just to really demonstrate what you can use. And I think the trees are quite dry. I can work on that distant hill, get my small brush, and I'm going to work wet in wet on that distant hill. I'm going to get some raw sienna. Put some more raw sienna on there. Take a little bit of burnt sienna, just a tiny, tiny bit. A little bit of burnt sienna, wet in wet with that raw sienna. And a tiny, tiny bit of green. And just wet in wet, the raw sienna, the burnt sienna, a little bit of green, and I'm just making that background hill not so obvious, not so in your face, up close. Very small brush. Just tipping the tip of the brush back there. A bit of texture on that hill. And that's all it needs to just kind of push it into the background a little bit more green maybe. And these little holes in the tree here, I don't want those to be bright raw sienna either. Fill those up with a little bit of darker raw sienna. And I think we're pretty close to the time when we're going to paint the tea towels. So get ready. We're going to use some like orange and yellow and the green that we've mixed up and paint the tea towels. They're fun to do. And the photo, most of the tea towels are the same in the photo. They're the same design. And I wanted to leave a few more white tea towels in mine, but it's absolutely up to you whether you have white tea towels, different color tea towels, or whether you want to sort of do like the photo and have more of the colored tea towels. That's up to you. You design your washing, but I'm going to get some really, really clean water because I want really, really clean colors. I'm just going to go get that. I just do these by the seat of my pants in an abstract kind of a way. I don't really draw out the pattern or try and follow the pattern exactly. Just sort of look at the pattern and think, what's the general idea of that? So I'm going to mix an orange with, you can mix an orange with anything that you have that makes orange. You can use your bright yellow with rose. You can use your bright yellow with cadmium red. You can use an orange that you have, such as cadmium orange or transparent orange. You can use pretty much anything. If you want a slightly softer orange, you can use the one that we did today with the triad, which was the raw sienna and the rose. which will make a much softer one. So I'm going, and there's even a little bit of yellow on these tea towels, and the greens that you've mixed are going to be great for the tea towels too. So I'm going to start with my Azo Yellow and some Cadmium Red. Oh, there's my Cadmium Red. And I'm going to mix an orange to start with. That one's pretty good. I also want a gentler one. I want the Raw Sienna and Rose one, because I want to echo other colors that I have in the painting. Oh, that's way too much Raw Sienna. I can get a bit more rose. I have some just pure yellow. There's a little bit of pure yellow in the tea towels. And I got those colors ready. And my little number 2 brush. And here we go. You kind of start with what you can see. I can see, and I've got the photo right here. I can see kind of a poppy shape here. And I'm going to go into the more rosy one next to it. There's kind of another little poppy shape next to it. Now I'm not following the design faithfully that I can see. I'm just using it to help me kind of make an abstracty tea towel. And get some yellow, and there's some sort of flowers here, and there's a butterfly. Just kind of making those shapes, and I'm going to make those shapes and putting a bit of yellow on first. I'm getting my orange, a bit of flower shape, odd shape here. Don't know what that is, just to make an odd shape. Flower shape. Coming over the top here, there's, and of course I need to leave space for the green to go in. There's going to be green on the tea towels too. I can't do that till the orange is dry. They're sort of like trumpet flowers on here, I think. A little bit of yellow. There's one kind of in this direction. Little butterfly shape. One thing to remember is don't stop your design before you get to the edge. Make your design go right over the edge so that it looks natural. Now I've got all those kind of orangey, yellow, pinky, flowery type shapes on there, and I'm going to move on to the next one because I want to come back with green when these are dry. And I'll start again on the next one with a little bit of yellow here and there, so I can so that my orange will mix wet in wet with the yellow. And this side of the towel that's folded will be in shadow, but we can put the shadow on after we get the designs on. That way the designs will be under the shadow, which will look more natural. As a, I'm looking at the wrong tea towel now. Look at the right tea towel that I'm supposed to be doing here. Some of the shapes are just not discernible when you look at it. So just make whatever shape it kind of looks like. It doesn't have to look exactly like a flower or a butterfly. It just needs to look roughly like the shapes that you're seeing. And once you get some green bits in there as well, your imagination will fill in the rest. Now I want to leave the next one just white, but I want to do this one with, now this one further along the line is much more faded. So I'm going to fade my colors out by adding water to them. That's how to fade out the colors. So I've added water to my colors, and that way my tea towel will look kind of faded. It's further away, so much less detail needed. And if this one is going to be white, I can use my Cobalt Blue for shadows, very diluted, very diluted. So there's a little bit of a shadow along the, let's zoom in so you can see a little better. I've just got some Cobalt Blue, very diluted with water. There's a shadow as it comes along the line there. There are some folds from the pegs. And I'm going to add the tiniest bit of rose, just a tiny bit of rose to that cobalt to make it a little bit more lilac. And I'm going to use that for the shadow this side where it folds over. And this is one of the dangers of masking fluid. I thought I'd got my masking fluid on very carefully, but it's not got a perfect edge. Whereas if I'm painting around that tea towel, painting my sky around the tea towel, I can get a much more perfect edge than I got with my masking fluid. You know, it's helpful to have it on there because you don't have to worry, but at the same time, you don't always get a really perfect edge happening. I want, for more of my shadow, I want Cerulean Blue. I want a slightly cooler blue, and I want to put that slightly cooler blue, very diluted, just here. So I've got a little bit very diluted because it's a white tea towel. Just want a little bit of cerulean on that side, just to give a little bit of shadow. It'll dry lighter too. Now I've got to pick up the rest of my masking fluid before I can paint the rest. So I need to continue. My house paint's dry. I need to continue pulling this off of here. The other thing you can't get with the masking fluid is you can't get nice thin straight lines, whereas you can if you're using a pen or paint. So I think I got the rest of it off. There is one tea towel on the line that's sort of got a different design. It's kind of a checker design, and I kind of like that there's one oddball one there. So I want to put that one on. The first thing it has, I'm diluting my yellow right out because they're a little bit washed out. It has a line of yellow down it and some fold of yellow this side. And it has some rosy color. So let's get my rose. Just rose, I think, by itself. I can always put some shadow on it if it's too much. There's some rosy color here. And here. And where it's folded back. And going across here. I know it's going over the yellow, but that's okay. It's kind of white where it's folded back. And I'll put some blue on in a moment. So I've just got the pinks and the yellows on. A little bit more yellow. And I also can continue working along here now with the yellow pegs. Got my nice bright yellow. And these pegs along here were yellow. Although I would like to have maybe 1 or 2 turquoise ones. Pop those in. This one and this one. Put those in. And the tea towels that are further along here, they are nowhere near as bright as the ones that are close to you. So the way to get them less bright is to really, really dilute your colors out with a lot of water. And just, you're not going to do hardly any detail on those. You're just going to kind of like spot around with your very, very diluted colors, suggesting the patterns on those tea towels. Just very, very easily just pop them on there. And leave this one white. Add a little bit more color to this one. And my pegs should be dry. I can go back and put in some blue and turquoise pegs. Literally in any order, doesn't really matter. Bluer one here. I can't remember if that one's wet or not. I don't think so. Yeah, we're good there. And by the time I've done all that, this first one is dry enough that I can put the green in here now. So I'm going to go back to one of my greens that I mix for the trees and add a little bit of yellow to that and a little bit of raw sienna, so it's not too bright. Let's add a little bit of yellow, a little bit of raw sienna to that green, but not all of it. I've left some dark green on the side in case I want to add a little bit of dark green to the painting as well. But I'll start with the lighter greens, add a little bit more water to that. I don't want it too strong. And move that over. So coming out from the peg here first, just some, and it's a little bit darker coming out from under the peg. Green. Dilute it out with water. Anytime you want it a little bit lighter, not so strong, dilute it out with some water. And I'm sort of making some kind of leaf shapes. And some kind of stem shapes. There's quite in that flower that's right here, like it's like a poppy, there's a center to it. And because it's right up close here, that's one place you can add a little bit of detail like that. That's more clear. And don't forget that there needs to be white left on this tea towel too. Don't fill up the whole thing with green and orange. Remember to leave some white showing. the pattern where it's folded here is much, much darker. So I'm making a much darker green there. And also up by the pegs where there's a fold, it's quite a lot darker there too. I'm going into my darker green just there. I'm looking at my reference photo, but I'm not copying it. I'm just kind of looking for where the greens are and what the shapes look like, basically. You can copy it if you want to. If you feel more at home copying what you see there, because that's easier, then just do that. That's great. Do what you're comfortable with. And of course, this one that's much further away is much less strong. This color's not as strong, less colored. And these ones further down the line, again, much less colored. So you don't need as much on those. Whoops, that's even too much. Just get some off my brush. What we will do with some of these over here is just put a few blue shadows on when the colors are dry. This tea towel, I'm going to add a little bit of Cerulean Blue to the design. There's some blue coming through. Oh, too strong again. Have to dilute it out so much to get it the right strength. There's a little bit of blue in the design. Adding a little bit more color to this one. And I think my yellow pegs are dry enough that I can put the turquoise pegs in. And now this one's dried up a bit. I'm going to add a little bit more color to the shadow side, adding a little bit more cobalt and rose shadow on this side. Not quite strong enough. And of course, some of the others are going to need some shadow. These white ones at the end, Cerulean Blue is going to be a good one for the shadow on these. And I think we got a little bit too much masking fluid on between them. And what I need is some house color between there. I should have some green in here. Probably not the best time to put it in, but there you go. It's going in there anyway. I think I blended it in okay. Can always do a little bit of planking to get it. Planking's just a little bit too dark, so I'm going to wet that down, dab it, just lighten it up a little bit. Oh, and we have another white tea towel which could do with a little bit of shadow. So I really like the cobalt blue with the rose to make a sort of just a violety blue color. Makes a really nice shadow color. That's what I'm using here, just little bit of cobalt, a little bit of rose, make a sort of violet blue. For the white tea towel here. I'm blending that out. I'm wetting my brush, getting a clean wet brush and just blending that shadow in with a clean wet brush so it's nice and soft. Another place the masking fluid didn't get a clean edge. And I'm cleaning that up with my brush. So two colors that are great for shadow are the Cerulean Blue, very diluted, and then the Cobalt Blue with a little bit of rose in to make a sort of a violet color, very diluted. Again, you need to really, really dilute some of those colors. I think right here is ready for some shadow. So I'm just going to use that Cobalt Rose mix. And I'm just going to paint it right over this to give it a little bit of shadow where it curls up. And same thing. There's shadow along the line. I've got the Cobalt and Rose just very, very diluted. Where the washing line goes behind it, where the pegs pull it, it's got some shadows. I'm just putting that on with the very, very diluted Cobalt and touch of Rose just to make it slightly violet, just slightly. And the same thing, I need to have a bit of shadow on the next one here, along where the washing line is, where the pegs pull at it. And of course we did the fold already. Another thing I'm noticing where I use the masking fluid, although I was very careful how I took it off with a pickup, I didn't use my fingers. It has distressed the paper so that my shadow colors are not going on really nicely. I have 100 reasons why I don't like masking fluid. I still tried it out today, but I still struggle with that stuff. It's a little bit more shadow here. It has so many downsides to it. I'm working my way along the washing line, kind of working on the shadows now. This one has a little bit of shadow on the curl here. And looking at my photo as well. It's got quite a shadow along the edge here, actually, on the photo. I'll have a little bit here. And also as I come along to this one here, this whole edge is in shadow, right over the colored area. And the folded part that comes over it is really, really bright white. It's going to edge it just here. And there's, again, the shadow right where the line is. And here too, shadow where the line is. The shadows always look so dark when you put them in, but they help. They help with the look that they are pegged. Shadow from those bits that are curled up. The edge of this one is very blue. I'm going to use just pure cobalt with a tiny bit of cerulean in it, because it is a very strong blue on the edge of this tea towel. And I've still got that cerulean with a little bit of cobalt, and I think we can have a bit more of that going through this tea towel. And I'm going to pull back a little bit so it's not so up close. It always looks a bit too detailed up close. And maybe put a few more little green parts on this one. And then I got to think, what haven't I done? Haven't done the black lines for the telephone lines, haven't done the finishing white lines. I don't like the white line that came from the masking fluid. So it's just a couple of those things to do. And then we'll be just about finished. So I'm going to get my white paint again and my little tiny liner brush. And fix this line that the masking fluid did such a poor job of. And also, if you, other places that the masking fluid did a poor job on the edges of my washing here, I'm going to fix those too with some white. Oh, got a big thing in my white now. And if you've lost any of the white in your washing that you want to get back, then if you have some white paint, white gouache, Dr. P.H. Martin's white, it's very, very helpful. I'll try and get my washing line in. I'm going to find a pot to put my, I have a white pot somewhere. Here it is. I knew I had a white pot somewhere. I'm getting my white just the right consistency. There we go. I still have to try and get my washing line through the house here. Through here. And then matching up with the one that I did earlier. A little bit globby, isn't it? You can put a few highlights on your pegs if you want to have like a couple of little highlights on them. I'm just gonna, I have to twist it around because I can't get my arm around the right way to do a nice straight line. There we go. And I am just going to use a black pen for the lines of the telephone wires or whatever these are. There's some kind of a device here. They come around this pole. They come around and behind the trees here somehow. A couple here. And they somehow attach to this pole that's on the side. There's also some on the other side as well. Again, I'm going to have to twist it, I'm afraid. There's a couple out here. And one other thing I want to do is my roof is a little bit too clean and tidy. So I'm going to get some Raw Sienna and maybe some bluey gray. and I just want to put a bit more color on my edge of my roof in places, not maybe on the whole thing, but it seems a bit too bright and clean in places. So just want to shade that up a bit, dirty it up a bit, make it a bit more like the picture, so it's not standing out so much. A little bit of shadow on here. There isn't any on the photo, I don't think. I'm just a little bit on there, and I think we're just about done. I might, now that my trees are dry, I want that dark green, and as this tree here is in front of those other trees, so I just want to add a bit more dark green to put that tree in front of those other trees. And once your hill is dry too, you can always add a little bit more, and adding just a little bit more greenery to the hill, putting it on, and then just smushing it in with a wet brush, just so it's looks like it's got a bit of grass that's drying up in the background. So I think I'm just checking to see if I'm just about all done. Oh, I know what I did. I did one tea towel here that was a bit more red because it's against the green, and that looks kind of nice. So I'm going back to my mix that is Raw Sienna and Rose, and I think I'm going to do that on this one too. Just a tea towel that's against that green house siding. I just want one that's going to complement it by being a bit of a rosy color. So it's just got my Rose and Raw Sienna. I'm having a bit more of a rosy tea towel there. And I have a bit of pattern behind that, but that's okay. Not worried about that. I think take one last look at it and see if I need any more color on these. Maybe just a touch because they're near the green, just have a little bit more color. It fades so much when it dries that sometimes you want to go back and add a little bit more. And then I think leave it alone. I think that's important once you get to that point, that you don't overdo it. And there's a washing line, and there's my first one, there's my second one, and there is the original photo by Janet Fleming Ritchey, a friend of a friend, who has given me some lovely photos to work from. Oh,
So how did you do? Is your washing dry? Does it look great? I hope you enjoyed painting this, and I'll see you again next time. Thanks for joining me.